Welcome to Resistance Live. Since 2017, Resistance Live has been the go-to home for political and legal news and analysis through a decidedly progressive activist lens. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. I'm a former Wall Street and human rights lawyer, a lifelong organizer, and a leadership and impact consultant for all those seeking to lead big progressive change in these incredibly challenging times. To get bonus broadcasts, ask questions, and more, don't forget to become a paid subscriber to the show at patreon.com/resistancelive. And to learn more about what we do to help progressive leaders everywhere, check out GaiaLeadershipProject.com. And now, here's today's show. Hey everyone, welcome to the show. It's Friday, February 13th, 2026. I know that a lot of you wanted to hear from me about Kristi Noem's performance on Wednesday afternoon. We talked about it a little bit on the Wednesday morning broadcast. Not Kristi Noem's performance, Pam Bondi's, my bad. And we're going to talk about it today in a bunch of different contexts because there were a lot of questions on the Patreon feed about how Pam Bondi can be held responsible, about why she's acting the way that she's acting, about potential things that non-lawyers have been throwing around on social media about potential accountability. And I just want to make this very clear, okay? I think that politically, this is a strategy. Is it going to come back to bite her? Yes. But from the standpoint of legal accountability, there are a number of legal doctrines that are in the way. And I want to make sure everybody understands that so that you know when you are seeing garbage on the internet and you don't get your hopes up, okay? So, for everybody who missed it, I think everybody's gotten the short version of this now. I watched, I would say 90% of this hearing on Wednesday because I had an opportunity to tune in for a little bit. And, she was incredibly dismissive of all the Epstein survivors to the point that it was really disgusting. She was asked a lot of questions. She was combative. She had a burn book that was designed to essentially attack members of Congress as they were asking her questions so that she didn't have to answer them. And then what came out very shortly after the hearing was that she had in that burn book records of the search histories of members of Congress who had gone to the DOJ to search the unredacted Epstein files. Sorry, I have hair on my face. And one of the things that has come out of that is that it's very clear that they're actually surveilling members of Congress when they go to the DOJ and doing it for political purposes to score points. This is something, by the way, that has exploded in the last 36 hours. There is now a call for an investigation into this because clearly, while, search histories generally are maintained as a part of metadata, the weaponization of them against individual members of Congress is a new layer of this cover-up and attempt to hide what is actually inside the Epstein files, to use the documents that they're searching for and those search histories as weapons in congressional hearings is unheard of. And that's on top of the fact that she refused to acknowledge the Epstein victims, she's refused to meet with them. And her attitude toward all of this was belligerent. Aggressive is probably an understatement, and despicable, truly. So let me say a couple of things about my takeaways from this, because I know some of you had asked on the Patreon for my thoughts. I will tell you that there were certain moments in the way that she responded, particularly around the now famous, the Dow has hit $50,000. Of course, the Dow is not in dollars, but, around that comment. At that moment in the hearing, my reaction to it actually was that she appeared to be terrified. And I say that from the standpoint of somebody who is clearly an attorney, right? She was the former Attorney General of Florida. We've talked about, her role in that regard. And why people should not be screaming for her head as a result of the fact that she was in Florida, because she wasn't actually in charge of the initial Epstein investigation in any way, shape, or form. But one thing that is very clear from the standpoint of where she sits is that it cannot be escaping her right now that she is involved in a conspiracy to cover up the Epstein files. I actually find it really difficult to imagine that there's not any way at this point that she doesn't actually know that she's cooked. And, that doesn't mean that she's going to be prosecuted anytime soon. It doesn't mean that there's going to be, some form of immediate accountability for it beyond calling for her impeachment and resignation. But it does mean that it's very clear that she has she is in a place where she understands that her entire legacy is toast. And I think that the only reason, in addition to the fact that it's DARBO, which we've talked about a lot here, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, there was a lot of deny and attack. One of the things that I just want to make really clear here is that she knows what she's doing, okay? And that means that she is taking instructions from the president and his staff and from others who are influencing her, like Todd Blanche, as she is operating to cover up what is in the files, okay? Now, we had a lot of questions on the feed about whether or not she could be sued. Could there be a class action against her? What about RICO? So let me take you through the legal implications of all of this, all right? Because I want people to get really clear on how this works, all right? From a civil litigation standpoint, which is what suing Pam Bondi would be, right? We're not talking about criminal prosecution right now. We're talking about suing, all right? Could the Epstein file survivor sue Pam Bondi? And the short answer to that is no. There's two legal principles that prevent that. The first is what's called sovereign immunity. And sovereign immunity is a principle that says, if you, as a government official, are acting within the scope of your governmental authority when you are making decisions, you cannot be sued for anything, okay? The exceptions to that are something that we have talked about before, which is the Federal Tort Claims Act. But the Federal Tort Claims Act, as we have discussed, has very significant limitations. First and foremost, you have to go through the Office of Management and Budget to get a right to sue letter. You have to tell them that you're going to sue somebody or the government, and they have to review it and give you a certain amount of time before they tell you whether or not it's okay for you to sue. And if the time expires, then you can as well. The FTCA only waives sovereign immunity for negligence. It does not waive sovereign immunity for intentional acts. So if she has made a choice, leaving aside, again, this is in the scope of her sovereign immunity. She's making an intentional choice to hide certain things in the files. I don't think there's any argument that she's negligent in this, right? That she just isn't paying attention, right? That's not what's happening, okay? If there is an intentional choice to actually do something that then inflicts harm, sovereign immunity applies. The Federal Tort Claims Act doesn't cover that. It covers things like a slip and fall in front of a federal building, all right? So there is not, at this point, any way to bring a civil cause of action against Pam Bondi from the Epstein survivors, all right? On top of that, we've talked about class actions here quite a bit, but I'm going to remind people of this. Class actions are governed by Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. And you can't just randomly say, I'm filing a class action and have it go forward. You have to actually meet the requirements of Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure in order to determine whether or not a class will be certified. That's the language in the legal lingo, okay? There is a hearing at the beginning of an alleged class action that is called a class certification hearing. I used to do these all the time. And essentially that hearing is designed to determine whether or not you can prove that the requirements of Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure have been met. Now, there's a series of requirements that you have to meet there, some of which are about things being in common for every member of the class, okay? Again, this is very hard to prove in tort cases because people's injuries are different, all right? One person ends up with complex PTSD. The other person merely has sleeplessness, okay? One person ends up with clinical depression. The other person ends up with an anxiety disorder, okay? These are things that preclude a class action from proceeding because there is not what's called commonality in the class. In addition to that, you have to prove that common issues predominate. This is the predominance requirement of Rule 23, that common issues predominate over non-common issues. Now, in some class action cases, this is really easy, okay? I'm going to give you a really benign example from my own civil practice history, okay? I litigated one of the largest class actions in history at the time involving what was referred to as mutual fund timing. What happened here was that people who were responsible for selling and purchasing mutual funds timed the market so that they could make more money with your money, but not have to give it back to you. Those were essentially the allegations, all right? The common trajectory of facts was all the same. All of these huge houses, right? Like these huge, not even just investment banks, but banks that you might have invested with. Like, let's say, I can't even remember who was in it, but there were a number of huge mutual fund companies. They were all engaging in the exact same pattern and practice, right? They were timing the market so that they could make money on your money, all right? Exactly the same. The only thing that differed was the amount of the damages, okay? And in that instance, the facts of the entire pattern and practice by all these different institutions was exactly the same and therefore met the predominance requirement, okay? Again, I have to point this out. There are differing facts for each of the Epstein victims. Some of them have had their names disclosed, some of them haven't. Some of them are public facing, and that means that they're comfortable with having their names out there. Some of them are not. Some of them experience different forms of harm, even arguably at the hands of Pam Bondi here, right? Some may have had their photographs and their videos that were taken by them disclosed to the public. Some might not. And that's not even including like the different forms of harm that each of the victims may be suffering. So it is not a case where there would, even if you could file a civil cause of action against Pam Bondi, you know, again, Federal Tort Claims Act sovereign immunity, the class action requirements would not be met. Okay. Very uphill battle. Like never say never, but I think it's extremely unlikely. All right. And that's on top of the fact that she has sovereign immunity for decisions, intentional decisions she makes as the AG. Somebody else mentioned RICO. Like, could a RICO case be brought against, like, you know, involving the Epstein case? Okay. So this is the point where I have to remind you, it's been a while since we did this. Back when the Fulton County case brought by Fani Willis alleged RICO actions under Georgia law against all the people who conspired to try to overthrow the 2020 election results. We did like broadcast upon broadcast about RICO. So let me just tell you about RICO, all right? Because I know it's been a while. You know, that was like, I don't know, 2021. So let's just talk about it right now a little bit, because there are people out there who are not lawyers saying that a RICO case could be brought involving Epstein. That is impossible at this point. Okay, unless you give me a really specific case. And I'll tell you why. Generally speaking, when you bring a RICO case, there are several precursory requirements to that case being successful, okay? One of them is that you have to identify a RICO enterprise, okay? Historically, when RICO was used to prosecute the mafia, that was designed to be a case against the criminal enterprise of the mafia that, let's say, hypothetically, was extorting businesses throughout a certain region, okay? Like, you know, let's just call it like New Jersey Waste Management, okay? Like speaking of The Sopranos. And, you know, one of the ways in which RICO works is that you have to be able to identify the specific enterprise, okay? You have to say this company or organization of people is defined. You have to actually define it as a criminal enterprise, and it has to meet the criminal enterprise requirements of the RICO statute. Then you also have to be able to prove something called predicate acts. And that generally requires you to be able to prove 3 predicate acts under the federal RICO statute. So that means you have to prove 3 prior crimes before you can even satisfy the RICO statute. And those crimes are not any random crime. They are specifically enumerated in the RICO statute, okay? So they're things like mail fraud, wire fraud, bribery. I think bribery is in there. I can't even remember. We never did a bribery case in my RICO things, but they're like financial related crimes, okay? Fraud of various sorts, extortion, murder qualifies, okay? But in order to prove these cases at trial, you have to also prove the predicate acts, okay? So the big questions I have around any potential RICO case involving the Epstein case, which, by the way, is really ill-defined. Who are you suing or who's being prosecuted, right? What's the criminal enterprise? How are you going to define it? Because it's not like there's some company, right, or mafia-style organization where there's like a hierarchy, right, that is engaged in like what's contained in the Epstein files. Hard to define. Not going to say it's impossible, but hard to define. Okay. Challenged lawyers, I'm sure, are trying to find a way to do this. But keep in mind that also a federal RICO court action for prosecution would have to be brought by the DOJ. Okay. You have to be able to identify the people who you're prosecuting and the allegations against them. If you're going to bring a civil RICO case against people, which is possible, same story. You're suing somebody for damages. You got to be able to identify all these things. Okay, including the prior crimes. You file a civil RICO lawsuit against somebody, you still have to prove predicate acts like wire fraud and mail fraud and the like. Okay, so let me just say this. Okay, people who are out there saying like a RICO case should be brought against the Epstein case or whatever, honestly need to understand that these are not easy cases to bring and prove. Okay, if you were to try to do this, you would have to be able to identify a functioning organization that was engaged in sex trafficking. Like, what was that organization? What's the name of it? Okay, again, we have problems here, right? It's not to say like, the mafia, the Cosa Nostra, right? They had like families that were running things, right? Like the Gaudis. And this was something where even if it wasn't like a formalized company, you could identify an organization, right? You could identify the Don, you could identify the consigliaries, you could identify the lower level guys who were killing people, right? All of whom reported up the chain inside the organization. So when you think about this through the lens of the Epstein files, Epstein, of course, being dead, the question then becomes like, who else is in this organization? Ghislaine Maxwell, who's already gone to prison, right? Who else? And how are you going to define the organization? And what are your predicate acts going to be? And do they meet the requirements of the RICO statute? Okay. These are not simple questions. This is one reason, by the way, and I talked about this at the time that Fani Willis brought her case, that RICO cases are brought exceedingly rarely. Like, I think I did maybe 2 or 3 in the 15 years that I was in civil practice. And most of the time, we didn't win those cases on a RICO count. We might have won it on other things, but we didn't win it on RICO. And that's because they're incredibly difficult to prove. People like them because they allow for like extensive damages and they can like really elevate prison sentences if you do them from a criminal perspective. But they are not easy to prove. And I think there's a lot of like romanticism out there about like a RICO case can bring down so many people at once, kind of, but not if you don't meet the requirements of the statute. Okay. So again, there's a lot of things in our legal system that are precluding the kind of accountability that we might want to see right now, but all hope is not lost. Okay. So I want to remind people of something really significant. All right. When this administration turns over, when we have somebody else in the White House and the entire government is reframed from a different perspective, hopefully through a very progressive lens, an aggressive federal prosecutor will be able to bring charges against Pam Bondi, for instance, for things like corruption. And this is one reason why when we think about 2028, which I really don't want to do today because we're so far out from that, but one of the things that's going to be really key here is, are we electing people who are willing to bring people to account? Are we talking about potential attorney general nominees who are willing to prosecute people? Are we thinking about maybe separate bodies of prosecution? I've raised this within the last few weeks, like a Nuremberg trial format that could be established through legislation in the House and the Senate. Because there are all sorts of ways in which accountability could come, but not right now. Not right now. And so, I want people to be really clear on this stuff, how class actions work, how RICO statutes work, what sovereign immunity is, what the Federal Tort Claims Act prohibits, so that you don't get wrapped up in the prospect that anyone is coming to save us right now. Okay. Like we're it. And even under state law, okay, because there are, of course, state RICO statutes. That's how the Fulton County case was brought by Fani Willis. You still have to meet, baby RICO acts usually parallel the federal RICO act entirely. And it has to be based in the state for jurisdictional purposes. So is Florida going to bring an Epstein case against co-conspirators? Kind of don't think so, right? And there was a federal investigation ongoing led by Maureen Comey in the Southern District of New York when Trump took over and he fired her. That was our opportunity for federal prosecution. State-based RICO in New York State, very hard to prove. I don't know. Letitia James might try it if she has evidence, but where's our nexus? Where's our criminal enterprise? So again, like really important to understand, like not just that who you follow matters, but that you have to understand the legal ramifications of what people are saying. All right. So taking off my Columbia law professor hat, ex-Columbia law professor hat right now. But that's kind of like where I want to put that. I want you all to understand it very clearly. Okay. Other news today that I think is really key. Actually, let me say just a couple other things really quickly about the Federal Tort Claims Act before I forget. The other thing about the Federal Tort Claims Act that is really significant is you can't get punitive damages. So even if you can sue the government, let's say like you slip and fall in front of a federal building and your case is approved by the Office of Management and Budget and you can bring it in federal court, okay? anything that is punitive, like you should have fixed that sidewalk, you knew it was damaged, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, I'm entitled to punitive damages, is a no-go. The only thing that you can recover from a monetary standpoint is actual damages, meaning like your medical costs. So again, really important to understand here that the limitations of the law right now are what they are, and they're pretty much prohibitive from any kind of private action or prosecution for political reasons right now because the DOJ is controlled by Trump. All right. We had kind of like a burgeoning situation, a burgeoning scandal. I mean, we already kind of knew about this, but we have like a burgeoning scandal right now with, surprise, surprise, Kristi Noem. Many of you know that there was an article that dropped yesterday. This is a weird article, by the way. I just want to point this out. Whoever leaked this has a real agenda. There's a lot of speculation right now about like who leaked it and why. There's a lot of speculation. It could be Stephen Miller. But I also want to point out that what was leaked were very personal details, and like nobody knows exactly where this is going to go. So one of the things that that is kind of like bizarre is that this was a very salacious article. Essentially, it talks about the fact that Corey Lewandowski, who is kind of like de facto running DHS right now without being nominated to any role, is having an affair with Kristi Noem. They're both married to other people. They have the DHS has bought apparently a 737 jet that Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski are using to fly around the country that has a private bedroom in the back. And in addition to that, we already know from like some of the things that have come out about Corey Lewandowski's role that a lot of the final approval for actions that are supposed to be decided by the Secretary of DHS are being decided by Corey Lewandowski instead. There are, big questions about the acquisition of this jet. And also very serious questions about how Kristi Noem stopped living in her apartment that was across the street from Corey Lewandowski's apartment in Washington, D.C., where they were seen coming and going from each other's apartments, how she ended up living on a military base under Coast Guard control. Coast Guard is a part of DHS, and why Corey Lewandowski is showing up there. So this all reminds me a little bit of what happened with Madison Cawthorn. You all will remember that, Madison Cawthorn's, in addition to the fact that he was just never qualified to serve in the House of Representatives, his career was destroyed when he went after the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, by leaked information about him and also videos of him doing things that were really inappropriate, like humping one of his guy friends, right? Allegations that he had talked about, women in particular ways that were really unpleasant. And that was after he had given an interview where he said that he had been invited to like coke and sex parties by other members of the House, Matt Gaetz. And, I just want to say this, okay? He was brought down by that stuff intentionally by someone inside his own party. This smells a lot like that. And so, in addition to the fact that there are articles of impeachment pending against Kristi Noem, that Democratic representatives and senators are out there, like as recently as this morning, calling for her to resign or be impeached. We now also have this kind of like very personal, dirty, salacious scandal that's being put out there by someone to try to essentially undermine her authority. And it kind of smells like it's coming from inside the House. So more to come on this. We'll see what happens with it. But, I never object when they're fighting amongst themselves. I'll just say that. Okay. We have to talk for a minute about the filibuster because it appears the Democrats have finally decided to find some balls in the Senate. Sorry for the French. My kid has picked up on that now, by the way. It's really hilarious. Now, every time my kid swears, they're like, pardon my French. I will just tell you that there are some strong signs here, okay? We did just have a bill that the Republicans really wanted to pass fail in the Senate because the Democrats invoked the filibuster and they didn't have the 60 votes they needed to overcome it. That now appears to be the direction that the SAVE Act is headed in as well. Because if somebody decides to filibuster it, they need a 60 vote majority to get it to the floor. So this, by the way, everybody who has said at certain points, they can't do anything. They're in the minority. I always have to point to Mitch McConnell because this strategy with the filibuster is what was adopted by the Republicans when they were in minority control over and over and over and over again. All right. So I'm happy to see this development. I honestly think the Democrats need to be using it like at every turn. And, again, don't stop calling about the SAVE Act because it has passed the House. it's anybody's guess whether or not it's going to make it to the floor of the Senate right now, but I'm assuming that somebody's going to invoke the filibuster because there are a lot of indications of that. Please keep making your phone calls demanding that people don't vote for the filibuster in the Senate. Don't vote for the SAVE Act in the Senate, rather, for all the reasons that we previously discussed. All right. Yesterday, Tom Homan made an announcement that ICE was withdrawing from Minnesota. I will just tell you that there are reports as recently this morning that people are still being kidnapped off the streets of Minneapolis and St. Paul and surrounding areas. All right. When this news broke, my immediate reaction was, I will believe it when I see it, because we know that they have had this whole setup already. They said they were pulling out of Chicago. ICE is still in Chicago, still kidnapping people in Chicago, like today. It may be fewer people, but that doesn't mean that they've totally drawn down all of the people that they put there. All right. However, I'm going to point out that I think that this is a sign of the success of the organizing that has taken place in Minnesota, which has been basically flawless. You know, we've talked about this before on this broadcast, but it's really incredibly key to note that the community organizing that has been done there, which is 80% secret, is the thing that has stopped more people from being murdered and more people from being kidnapped and has gotten in the face of ICE at every instance. So, like, shout out to everybody in Minnesota who's been fighting back. You guys have done a great job. I will just say that my suspicion about this is that they have made this announcement because they are concerned about the way that ICE is polling in relation to the midterm elections. And we are in primary season very shortly for the midterms. Like, first primaries are coming up next month. And so some of this may be about trying to tone down the perception of violence, not the actual violence, to try to have some impact on the way people feel about Republicans right now. We have to make sure that doesn't work, meaning that, like, even if they go dark, we're not letting people forget what they have done and are continuing to do. But I will take at the bare minimum the victory by, like, Minnesota organizers, because it's not small. And I'm just really, continue to be grateful on an ongoing basis for all the hard work that's being put in by everybody who lives there. It's a model of resistance built also on the back of what Chicago organizers did during the invasion of Chicago, which, by the way, as I said, has not stopped. So again, don't take your eyes off Minnesota. And I will just say that there's other breaking news that people should be aware of about conditions inside detention camps. Jamie Raskin went to one this morning. It is really, like, they're concentration camps. I know we have said this, but they're concentration camps, people. They have 60 people in tiny rooms with one toilet and no shower, sleeping under aluminum foil blankets where the lights are never turned off. So one thing I do want to mention is that there have been a series of local victories recently to stop ICE from buying warehouses, old abandoned warehouses, to use them as new concentration camps. We had a victory on this in no less than Kansas City yesterday, where people have organized locally to advocate not just for the companies that are selling those warehouses to not sell them, but also to affect zoning regulations that would prohibit those institutions from being put into play. This is a really good place to get involved where you live. And it's not like the locations are secret. Like, they have announced that there are places where they are trying to put an 8,500 person concentration camp, and they are trying to acquire a warehouse to do that. You must get involved locally where you live on these issues. You absolutely must be aware of what's happening in front of your city and your county councils when it comes to this, and what institution is trying to sell property to them. Because a number of these deals have fallen apart. Another one fell apart in Texas this week. This is a way to actually make sure that, like, ICE does not have the capacity to do what they are trying to do. All right. So shout out to all the organizers who are already working on that. Keep up all the really good work, and please get involved where you live to do more. Okay, that's it for today. There will be a bonus broadcast this afternoon for our Patreon subscribers only. If you want to join us on that and you're not yet a subscriber, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive. You can become a subscriber for as little as $5 a month. That's like 25 cents a broadcast. It's like the best deal in broadcasting right now. Also, please like this broadcast, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not yet a subscriber. And I will be back here on Monday on our regular schedule. And I hope everybody has a wonderful Valentine's Day. If that's your jam, it's not really mine. Enjoy yourselves. I hope somebody takes really good care of you. And please try to get some time off this weekend. All right, take care, everybody. I will see you soon. All right, bye. That's our show for today, folks. Thanks so much for being here at Resistance Live. To get more out of the show, including bonus broadcasts, the answers to all your most pressing political and legal questions, and way more, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive and become a paid subscriber. And don't forget to hit subscribe here on your favorite podcasting platform to make sure that you never miss an episode. See you next time.